The sickening crunch of splintering wood, followed by a percussive metallic clang, ripped through the quiet afternoon air of Willow Glen, a sound so violent, so out of place in the manicured tranquility of the neighborhood, it made Mark's blood run cold. He'd just pulled up to his mother's small, neat bungalow for his daily visit, a container of her favorite chicken soup, still warm on the passenger seat. Helen, his 82-year-old mother, was usually on the porch at this time, a book in her lap, her walker parked beside her ready with a smile, and the latest neighborhood news. Another crash louder this time, accompanied by a grunt of effort and a high-pitched, furious screech of words he couldn't quite make out. He slammed the car into park, his heart hammering against his ribs, a terrible premonition coiling in his gut. He vaulted from the car, sprinting towards the front of the house. The scene that greeted him was one of such wanton, deliberate destruction, it momentarily stole his breath. Henrietta Bishop, president of the Willow Glen Homeowners Association, a woman whose rigid posture and perpetually pursed lips were a fixture in the neighborhood, was systematically demolishing his mother's accessibility ramp with a 10-pound sledgehammer. Splintered planks of pressure-treated lumber, the ramp's main structure lay scattered across the pristine lawn like fallen soldiers. Twisted metal handrails, painstakingly installed to code, were bent and mangled. Ms. Bishop, her face flushed a furious red, her usually immaculate blonde coif askew, was raining blows down on what remained of the ramp's landing platform, each impact punctuated by a sharp, venomous exclamation. Ugly, unapproved. Blight on the neighborhood violates every aesthetic standard. This monstrosity will not stand. And there on the small porch, effectively trapped her face, ashen with terror and disbelief, was his mother. Helen was gripping the arms of her walker, her frail body trembling, her eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and a helpless, bewildered anger. She looked so small, so vulnerable a prisoner in her own home, while this vandal, this suburban terrorist, destroyed her only safe means of ingress and egress. Mark felt a surge of rage so potent, so primal, it almost buckled his knees. This ramp wasn't just wood and metal. It was his mother's independence, her dignity, her connection to the world, and Henrietta Bishop was destroying it with a vicious, gleeful abandon. Bishop. The name was a roar, ripped from deep within his chest, a sound that finally belatedly pierced through Ms. Bishop's destructive frenzy. She paused the sledgehammer held aloft, and turned her eyes, usually cold and calculating, now blazing with a wild, almost unhinged fury. Well, well, Mr. Shepherd, she spat, her chest heaving. Come to admire my handiwork. Your mother was repeatedly warned. This eyesore violates every aesthetic principle of Willow Glen. It's an unpermitted, unapproved alteration, and it's coming down. She gestured defiantly with the sledgehammer towards the ruined ramp. Unpermitted, unapproved. Mark's voice was dangerously quiet now, the initial shock giving way to a cold, precise anger. He moved, placing himself between Ms. Bishop and the remains of the ramp, his body a shield for his mother. That ramp, Ms. Bishop, was fully permitted by the city of Oakhaven. It was inspected and approved by the City Code Enforcement Office. It meets every single requirement of the Americans with Disabilities Act and all applicable state and municipal building codes. What you are doing, he said, his gaze unwavering, is committing multiple felonies: destruction of private property, vandalism, reckless endangerment, and given my mother's age and vulnerability, felony elder abuse. Ms. Bishop actually scoffed. HOA bylaws supersede your so-called city permits, Mr. Shepherd. This is private property, governed by our covenants, and our covenants demand aesthetic harmony. That ramp was an abomination. I am merely enforcing the will of the community. The will of the community. Mark echoed his voice, laced with a contempt so profound it was almost a physical force. Or your will, Ms. Bishop. Your twisted, obsessive need to control every blade of grass, every shutter color, every aspect of your neighbors' lives, even if it means trapping an elderly disabled woman in her own home. He could see his mother now, tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed to her chest as if to still the frantic beating of her heart. The sight of her distress, her fear, fueled the icy resolve coalescing within him. He was Mark Shepherd, Helen's devoted son. But he was also Mark Shepherd, chief of the city of Oakhaven's Department of Code Enforcement. And Henrietta Bishop had just declared war on everything he stood for, both personally and professionally. She had no idea the hornet's nest she had just obliterated with her sledgehammer. She had no idea of the storm that was about to break upon her perfectly coiffed head. Helen Shepherd had lived in her small, charming cottage in Willow Glen for over 40 years. She and Mark's late father, David, had bought it when Mark was just a boy, attracted by the mature trees, the friendly neighbors, and the promise of a peaceful suburban life. After David's passing 5 years ago, Mark had worried about Helen living alone, but she was fiercely independent, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering resilience. Her home was her sanctuary, filled with memories, with the scent of her beloved roses, with the comforting presence of her books and her knitting. But time, as it does, had taken its toll. Severe osteoarthritis in her hips and knees had gradually inexorably stolen her mobility. First, it was a cane, then a walker, and then, after a particularly bad fall that had resulted in a fractured hip, the doctors had told her that a wheelchair would be her primary means of getting around, at least for the foreseeable future. The 3 steps leading up to her front porch, once a minor inconvenience, had become an insurmountable barrier. Mark, determined to ensure his mother could remain in her cherished home, had immediately set about making it accessible. He'd consulted with occupational therapists, with accessibility experts, with reputable contractors. The centerpiece of the modifications had been the ramp, a sturdy, well-designed structure of pressure-treated lumber and non-slip composite decking with gentle slopes and continuous handrails, all built to exceed the stringent requirements of the city's building codes and the ADA. As the city's code enforcement chief, a fact he rarely broadcast in his personal life, Mark had an intimate, almost encyclopedic knowledge of these regulations. He had personally reviewed the plans, overseen the permit application process, submitted through a licensed contractor to avoid any appearance of impropriety, and ensured that every single detail, from the slope ratio to the landing dimensions to the height of the handrails, was not just compliant, but exemplary. The final inspection, conducted by one of his most senior and meticulous inspectors, had passed with flying colors. The ramp was quite literally a textbook example of safe, legal, and necessary accessible design. Willow Glen, however, was a neighborhood that prided itself almost to a fanatical degree on its aesthetic uniformity. It was a place of perfectly manicured lawns, of precisely trimmed hedges, of homes painted in a narrow HOA-approved palette of muted earth tones. Individuality was tolerated, but only within strictly defined parameters. And Henrietta Bishop, in her dual role as HOA president and self-appointed guardian of Willow Glen's visual purity, was the chief enforcer of this rigid conformity. Ms. Bishop, a woman whose own home was a monument to sterile, impersonal good taste, seemed to view any deviation from her narrow aesthetic standards as a personal affront. She was notorious for her aggressive enforcement of even the most trivial HOA bylaws, the precise placement of trash cans, the permissible height of garden gnomes, the approved species of ornamental shrubs. She had a particular disdain for anything she deemed utilitarian or out of character with the neighborhood's carefully cultivated image of upscale homogeneity. Mark had had minor run-ins with her before, mostly gentle rebuffs to her unsolicited advice about the color of Helen's flower pots or the unfortunate placement of a bird feeder. He had always managed to maintain a polite, if somewhat strained, civility for his mother's sake. He knew Helen valued her peace, and he didn't want to escalate minor neighborhood squabbles. But the ramp was different. The ramp was not a flower pot or a bird feeder. The ramp was a lifeline. The inciting incident. The first declaration of open hostilities from Ms. Bishop had occurred the day after the ramp's completion. Mark had just helped Helen navigate it for the first time, the joy and relief on her face, as she easily wheeled herself onto her beloved porch, a precious, heartwarming sight. Less than an hour later, an official-looking envelope had been hand-delivered to Helen's mailbox. It was from the Willow Glen HOA, signed by Henrietta Bishop, President. The letter was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive intimidation. It acknowledged the recent construction of a wooden appendage at Helen's property. It then stated, in no uncertain terms, that said appendage was in clear violation of Willow Glen's established aesthetic guidelines and architectural review protocols. It claimed the ramp was an unapproved structural alteration that detracted significantly from the visual harmony of the streetscape and negatively impacted the property values of adjacent homes. It demanded the ramp's immediate removal within 7 days, failing, which Helen would be subject to daily fines of $100 and potential legal action by the HOA to compel its demolition at her expense. Helen had been devastated, her brief moment of joy and relief shattered by Ms. Bishop's cold, bureaucratic cruelty. But it's for my wheelchair, Mark," she'd said, her voice trembling, the letter shaking in her hand. "How can they... Don't they understand I need it?" Mark had been furious, but he'd maintained a calm exterior for his mother. He'd immediately drafted a polite but firm response to Ms. Bishop and the HOA board. He'd explained in clear, simple terms the medical necessity of the ramp. He'd attached copies of the city-issued building permit, the certificate of occupancy, and a letter from Helen's orthopedic surgeon detailing her mobility impairments and the essential role of the ramp in her daily life and safety. He'd also subtly, but unmistakably, reminded them of the provisions of the Federal Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, both of which prohibit discrimination against individuals with disabilities and require reasonable accommodations in housing. He had hoped that a clear presentation of the facts and a gentle reminder of their legal obligations would suffice. He had underestimated the depths of Henrietta Bishop's arrogance and her obsessive commitment to her own narrow, prejudiced worldview. The rising action of Ms. Bishop's campaign to eradicate the offensive ramp had been a relentless barrage of bureaucratic harassment, intimidation, and outright malice. She had dismissed Mark's letter with a curt, condescending reply, stating that HOA aesthetic covenants take precedence over any so-called reasonable accommodations, and that the ramp was a flagrant disregard for the established character of Willow Glen. The daily fines began to accrue, accompanied by increasingly threatening letters demanding payment and removal. Ms. Bishop also embarked on a campaign to turn other residents against Helen and the ramp. She spread misinformation at HOA meetings and in neighborhood newsletters, claiming the ramp was structurally unsound, a blatant lie, given its city inspection and approval that it was a temporary eyesore that the Shepherds were refusing to remove and that it would inevitably lead to a decline in property values for everyone. She preyed on the anxieties of some residents, cultivating a sense of grievance and resentment against Helen for daring to prioritize her accessibility needs over Ms. Bishop's arbitrary aesthetic dictates. The first truly shocking escalation, and the one that demonstrated Ms. Bishop's willingness to engage in outright abuse of her power, had involved her attempt to have Helen's utilities cut off. Citing a completely fabricated HOA bylaw regarding unapproved exterior structures potentially interfering with utility easements, Ms. Bishop had lodged formal complaints with the city's water and power departments, demanding they inspect Helen's property and, if necessary, terminate her services until the offending ramp was removed. It was only Mark's intervention, as a concerned son not yet revealing his official capacity, and his ability to quickly produce all the necessary permits and cite the relevant city ordinances protecting utility access for legally permitted structures that had prevented this malicious tactic from succeeding. The utility companies, once presented with the facts, had dismissed Ms. Bishop's complaints as baseless, but the incident had deeply shaken Helen, leaving her fearful that she might be left without heat or water in her own home simply because of Ms. Bishop's vendetta against the ramp. The second shocking detail, the one that had pushed Ms. Bishop from bureaucratic harasser to active vandal, had been her attempt to physically obstruct the ramp. One morning, Helen had awoken to find a row of large, heavy-potted trees, a dozen of them each weighing several hundred pounds, placed directly in front of the ramp, completely blocking access. There was a note attached to one of the trees, written in Ms. Bishop's distinctive spiky handwriting, enhancing the streetscape. "Please do not disturb these valuable HOA assets." It was a clear act of intimidation, a deliberate attempt to render the ramp unusable. Mark had, with considerable effort, managed to move the trees, but not before Helen had been effectively trapped in her home for several hours, missing a doctor's appointment. He had documented the incident meticulously, taking photographs, collecting witness statements from a sympathetic neighbor who had seen Ms. Bishop directing a landscaping crew to place the trees. He had filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, demanding they censure Ms. Bishop for her actions. The board, clearly intimidated by their president, had responded with a weak, non-committal statement about ongoing discussions regarding neighborhood aesthetics. It was clear that Ms. Bishop was operating with impunity, her obsession with the ramp escalating to a dangerous, irrational level. And now this, the sledgehammer, the ultimate act of destructive arrogance. As Mark stood on the ruined porch shielding his terrified mother, the pieces of Ms. Bishop's campaign of terror clicked into place. This wasn't just about aesthetics. This was about power. This was about control. This was about a woman so consumed by her own petty tyranny that she was willing to endanger an elderly disabled woman, to destroy private property, to violate a multitude of laws, simply to impose her will. He gently settled his mother into a porch chair, his heart aching at her visible distress. "Stay here, Mom," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, though his insides were a maelstrom of rage. "I'm going to handle this. It's going to be all right." He pulled out his phone. First, he dialed 911, requesting immediate police assistance for an active destruction of property vandalism and elder endangerment. He provided Ms. Bishop's name as the perpetrator, still on scene, still armed with the sledgehammer. Then he made a second call, to his own office, to his deputy chief. "Ben," he said, his voice tight, "I need you to dispatch a senior code enforcement officer, preferably Jenkins or Alvarez, to my mother's address in Willow Glen. Immediately. We have an active, egregious violation of multiple building and safety codes involving the deliberate destruction of a permitted accessibility structure. And yes," he added, his voice hardening, "the perpetrator is the HOA president. I'll meet them on site. I'm already here." The midpoint twist was not a subtle revelation of hidden motives or secret alliances. It was the stark, irrefutable collision of Henrietta Bishop's petty HOA tyranny with the full, unyielding authority of municipal law embodied in the person of the very man whose family she had targeted. As Mark ended the call to his deputy, he turned back to Ms. Bishop, who had finally lowered the sledgehammer, her chest still heaving a look of defiant, self-righteous anger still blazing in her eyes. She clearly believed she was untouchable, her HOA presidency, a shield against any real consequences. "You're wasting your time calling the police, Mr. Shepard," she sneered. "This is an HOA matter. They have no jurisdiction here, and I am well within my rights as president to remove unapproved, unsightly structures that violate our community's covenants and devalue our properties." Mark allowed himself a small, cold smile. "Ms. Bishop," he said, his voice now devoid of any trace of personal anger, replaced by the calm, implacable authority of his office, "you seem to be operating under a number of rather serious misapprehensions. Firstly, the police most certainly do have jurisdiction when it comes to felony destruction of property, vandalism, and elder abuse, all of which you have committed here today in plain sight with multiple witnesses. Secondly, while HOA covenants do exist, they do not and cannot supersede municipal building codes, state laws, or federal accessibility mandates, all of which that ramp, or what's left of it thanks to your handiwork, was in full compliance with. And thirdly," he paused, letting his words hang in the air, watching as the first flicker of genuine unease began to penetrate Ms. Bishop's arrogant facade, "you seem to be unaware of who exactly you are dealing with." He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "My name is Mark Shepard, and I am the chief of the City of Oak Haven's Department of Code Enforcement. That ramp you just illegally demolished was permitted, inspected, and approved by my department. Every nail, every board, every slope, every handrail was in full compliance with every applicable code and regulation. What you have done here today, Ms. Bishop, is not just a crime. It is a direct, flagrant, and profoundly stupid assault on the laws and ordinances that I and my department are sworn to uphold. You have, in your arrogance, declared war on the city of Oak Haven. And I assure you, Ms. Bishop," his voice dropped to an icy, lethal whisper, "that is a war you are going to lose, spectacularly." The color drained from Henrietta Bishop's face. Her mouth opened, then closed, a small, choked sound escaping her lips. The sledgehammer slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering onto the ruined decking with a dull metallic thud. The HOA president, the self-proclaimed guardian of Willow Glen's aesthetic purity, was finally terrifyingly beginning to understand the true magnitude of her transgression. She had picked a fight with the wrong man, and she had picked it in the worst possible way. The rule of law was about to descend upon her with the full, unmitigated force of a Category 5 hurricane. The arrival of the first Oak Haven PD squad car, closely followed by a second, and then a few minutes later, by the distinctively marked vehicle of Senior Code Enforcement Officer Marcus Alvarez, transformed the quiet cul-de-sac into a scene of official, inescapable reckoning. Officer Alvarez, a grizzled veteran of countless code enforcement battles, a man who had seen every conceivable type of illegal construction and brazen defiance, took one look at the demolished ramp at the Sledgehammer lying amidst the debris at the ashen-faced, Ms. Bishop, now being questioned by a stern-faced police sergeant, and then at his boss, Mark Shepard, whose expression was a mixture of grim determination and barely suppressed personal anguish, and he let out a low whistle. Chief Alvarez said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Looks like you got yourself a real beaut here. What in the Sam Hill happened?" Mark quickly, concisely briefed him, his voice all professional, now detailing the ramp's permitted status, the nature of Ms. Bishop's illegal demolition, and the multiple flagrant violations of municipal building and safety codes. Alvarez listened intently, his notepad already out, his pen flying across the page. Destruction of a permitted accessibility structure. Chief Alvarez clarified, his eyebrows arching. Without a demolition permit, creating an immediate public safety hazard, endangering a dependent elderly resident by obstructing her sole means of safe egress. "Ma'am," he turned his attention to Ms. Bishop, who flinched as if struck. "You are in a world of trouble. A world of trouble." He enunciated each word with a deliberate, ominous precision. The climax of Henrietta Bishop's reign of terror was not a dramatic courtroom showdown, at least not initially. It was a swift, methodical, and utterly devastating administrative execution orchestrated by the very department she had so contemptuously disregarded, while the police officers proceeded with their criminal investigation, charging Ms. Bishop with felony destruction of property, vandalism, and elder abuse, charges that would see her handcuffed and transported to the county jail for booking. Officer Alvarez, under Mark's direct supervision, though Mark was careful to maintain an official distance, allowing Alvarez to take the lead in the formal citation process, began issuing a blizzard of code violation notices. Each notice, meticulously documented, cited a specific section of the Oak Haven Municipal Code that Ms. Bishop had violated: illegal demolition without a permit, creation of an unsafe structure, failure to maintain a property in a safe and sanitary condition, the debris from the ramp now constituted a hazard, obstruction of a required accessible egress, violation of stop work orders, which Alvarez verbally issued the moment he arrived, and which Miss Bishop, in her initial defiance, had clearly ignored by continuing her demolition. Each violation carried a hefty daily fine retroactive to the moment of infraction. Each one required immediate remediation, namely the safe removal of the hazardous debris and the reconstruction of the ramp to full code compliance, all at Ms. Bishop's sole expense. The cumulative effect of these citations, as Alvarez explained them to a now visibly trembling Ms. Bishop, was financially catastrophic. The initial fines alone would run into the tens of thousands of dollars, and they would continue to accrue daily until the violations were rectified. Failure to comply would result in the city undertaking the remediation work itself and placing a lien on Ms. Bishop's own pristine, perfectly manicured property for the full cost, plus substantial administrative penalties. And just so we're clear, Ms. Bishop Alvarez added his voice, devoid of sympathy. "Your HOA's so-called aesthetic guidelines have absolutely zero standing when it comes to matters of building safety, accessibility for the disabled, and compliance with duly permitted structures. You have, by your actions here today, not only committed serious crimes, but you have also declared war on the Oak Haven Municipal Code, and that, ma'am, is a fight you cannot possibly win." The HOA board, when informed of Ms. Bishop's arrest and the full extent of her illegal actions and the city's response, went into immediate meltdown. An emergency meeting was convened that very evening, a chaotic finger-pointing affair that saw Ms. Bishop attending via a staticky video call from the county jail's booking area, her request for immediate bail having been denied due to the severity of the charges and her clear disregard for lawful orders, summarily and unanimously impeached from her presidency and permanently stripped of all HOA authority. The remaining board members, terrified of potential personal liability and the city's wrath, quickly pledged their full cooperation with Mark's department and with any necessary remediation efforts at Helen's property. The falling action was a multi-pronged offensive. On the criminal front, Ms. Bishop, despite hiring a team of expensive lawyers who attempted to argue diminished capacity due to HOA-related stress, or to portray her as a well-meaning but overzealous community volunteer, found herself facing a formidable prosecution. The evidence against her, eyewitness testimony, photographic and video documentation of the demolition, the physical evidence of the sledgehammer and the destroyed ramp, and Mark's own expert testimony regarding the ramp's legal status and the dangers created by its destruction, was overwhelming. On the civil and administrative front, the city of Oak Haven, through Mark's Code Enforcement Department and the city attorney's office, pursued Ms. Bishop with relentless efficiency. The daily fines continued to mount. Stop work orders were made permanent. A notice of public nuisance was issued. When Miss Bishop, still defiant and refusing to authorize the necessary repairs to Helen's ramp, failed to meet the city's deadlines for compliance, Mark's department, following all due legal process, hired a licensed and bonded contractor to safely demolish the remaining hazardous portions of the old ramp and to construct a new, even more robust and accessible ramp for Helen, billing the entire cost plus substantial administrative fees and penalties directly to Ms. Bishop. A lien was placed on her Willow Glen home to ensure payment. Helen, though deeply traumatized by the attack on her home and her sense of security, found herself surrounded by an unexpected outpouring of support. Mark, of course, was a constant reassuring presence, but the wider community, shocked and ashamed by Ms. Bishop's actions, also rallied around her. Neighbors brought meals offered to help with errands and organized a neighborhood watch to ensure Helen felt safe. The contractor hired by the city to rebuild the ramp, a kind, compassionate man named Joe Peterson, went above and beyond, working closely with Helen and Mark to design a ramp that was not only perfectly functional and code compliant, but also aesthetically pleasing, incorporating planters for Helen's beloved roses along its railings. He even, at his own expense, repainted Helen's front porch and installed new, brighter lighting. The transformation of Willow Glen was palpable. The fear and intimidation that Ms. Bishop had cultivated for so long evaporated with her arrest. The HOA, under new, more sensible and compassionate leadership, began a long overdue process of reform. They rescinded dozens of Ms. Bishop's more arbitrary and punitive bylaws. They instituted mandatory training for all board members on fair housing laws, disability rights, and conflict resolution. They even established a Good Neighbor Fund to assist residents with necessary accessibility modifications. The focus shifted from rigid, superficial aesthetic conformity to genuine community well-being and mutual respect. The resolution of Henrietta Bishop's legal battles came nearly 2 years after her destructive rampage. On the criminal charges, she was found guilty by a jury of her peers of felony, destruction of property, and felony elder abuse. The judge, citing her egregious abuse of authority, her lack of remorse, and the profound emotional and financial harm she had inflicted on Helen Shepherd, sentenced her to 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay substantial restitution to Helen for her pain and suffering, and to the city of Oak Haven for the cost of the ramp reconstruction and the extensive code enforcement actions. The civil penalties and fines levied by Mark's department were equally devastating. By the time all was said and done, Henrietta Bishop was financially ruined. Her beloved Willow Glen home, the symbol of her status and her obsession with aesthetic perfection, was sold at auction to satisfy her debts to the city and to Helen. She emerged from prison, a broken, embittered woman. Her reputation destroyed her reign of terror, a permanent, shameful footnote in the history of Willow Glen. Helen Shepherd, with the unwavering love and support of her son, and the unexpected kindness of her transformed community, slowly regained her sense of peace and security. Her new ramp, beautiful and sturdy, became a symbol not of her vulnerability, but of her resilience and of the community's commitment to inclusivity. She resumed her place on the porch, her books and her knitting once again, her companions, her smile, though perhaps a little more fragile than before, genuine and warm. Mark, watching his mother navigate her new ramp with ease, a quiet joy in her eyes, felt a profound sense of relief and a quiet, deeply satisfying sense of justice served. He had protected his mother not just as a son, but as a public servant, upholding the laws and codes that were designed to ensure safety, accessibility, and dignity for all. The sledgehammer was gone, its destructive echo silenced. In its place was the quiet hum of a community, rebuilding a community, learning a community that had, through a painful but necessary ordeal, rediscovered its own capacity for compassion, for decency, and for a beauty that was far more than skin deep. The true aesthetics of Willow Glen were no longer defined by rigid rules and superficial appearances, but by the strength of its human connections and the unwavering belief that every resident, regardless of age or ability, deserved to feel safe, respected, and at home.